How's
You
my
have-
audio? My audio good?
It's good.
Okay.
Yeah, it sounds nice.
Okay. Okay.
This is Erdi will be with me today.
And Jay, where are you today?
I'm in Bodrum at the
In
moment.
Bodrum. Okay.
Yeah, at my office. It's a bit cold over here, so
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
And Zorbey says hello and thanks you a lot, but now he's busy with the IT stuff at the moment, so he
Okay.
won't be able to join us today. But he's with
Okay.
us.
Okay.
And how are you? How are the things at the Mises Institute?
Yeah, everything's good. Everything's good. I really hated to miss PFS this year, but hopefully next year.
Hopefully next year. Erdi will start with the first question.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks for having us. First of all, maybe we can start directly with Mises Institute Turkey. We have been working voluntarily for Mises Institute Turkey, and basically we just want to spread the idea of liberty. So we would like to know about your general opinion about Mises Institute Turkey, about us. Maybe you would have some suggestions for us to be better.
Well, that's an interesting question. There's a lot of Mises Institutes, as you know, and obviously anyone's welcome to use the name to call themselves the Mises Institute. It's not something that we could own or control, nor would we want to. Now, the situation in Turkey is a little unique because obviously Hoppe lives there a significant portion of the year, and as a result, I know some people involved with Mises Institute Turkey, and also I get your material via email and Twitter, and I'm a little bit more familiar with it than some of the various, I think there's 18 or 19 Mises Institutes now. And I guess you guys are a little biased in that you probably have a more Hoppian, Rothbardian flavor from the get-go, from the beginning, because you're in Turkey with Jay and with Hans Hoppe and with Gulcin Hoppe. And so I do keep up with you guys. And more importantly, I keep up with Turkey because I've been there, I guess, 4 times. And it's just something that interests me quite a bit. So look, there are Mises Institutes which produce material that we don't necessarily agree with. There are Mises Institutes who receive funding from organizations that we don't necessarily admire. But hey, you know, it's a big world. Everybody's free to say and do what they want. And anything that's getting the name Mises out there, because as you two know, and as I certainly know in the United States, we've got a real monetary and economic conflagration potentially. And so I don't like to be, I don't like to try to police what other people do. As long as they're not saying anything too outrageous, we're happy to let Mises Institutes flourish wherever they may be. And as far as Turkey goes, yeah, it is tough because, normally you're a small group of people. You have just some tech requirements and fundraising. It's very strange. The nonprofit or fundraising environment, the donation environment in the U.S. seems to be better than in Europe and other places. And I think that's a variety of reasons. I think it's the way our tax code operates. We offer tax breaks for charitable deductions. I also think it's just part of the American history has been, well, up until maybe recently, pretty high trust and with a good, strong charitable mindset. But, it is tough to raise money, and so we're always sympathetic to that.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Our second question will be, as we know from your wonderful podcasts, you are familiar with the economic situation in Turkey. So which articles and books would you recommend for Mises Institute Turkey's readers?
Well, it's a very tough time, obviously, in terms of the Turkish lira. There's the economics of the situation in any country, and there's also the politics. Those tend to be two different things. I can speak a little bit to the economics of what's happening in Turkey. I can't really speak to the politics.
No problem.
Because that's so, in every country, the politics are so much on the ground. And Turkey's, 85 million people? So you're going to have serious opposition parties and this and that. I would say that Philip August's book on the Icelandic banking crisis of '08, it would really be a good book for Turkish leaders to read, because there is a way to, I think, get out of the current conundrum. And let's just step back for a moment and say, if you just look at Turkey in terms of its raw materials, its people, its geography, its location, it's actually, a country that ought to be rich. There's no good reason for Turkey not to be rich. I mean, it's located perfectly to be a free trade nexus between East and West. There's no reason on paper, with its workforce, with its people, with its natural resources, that Turkey couldn't be a Singapore, that Turkey couldn't be a tremendous tourist destination, which it is, but even more so, that Turkey couldn't be quite prosperous. So the problems Turkey has, like the problems America has, are self-inflicted. I think we have to start there. I want to say in about 2010, the lira to euro went down below 2 to 1.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not that long ago, guys. That's what, 13 years, 12 years. And there was an awful lot of talk since the 90s about Turkey joining the EU. There was a lot of talk about Turkey joining the Eurozone. There was a lot of talk about the Turkish economic miracle after the crash of 08-09. If you get into 10, 11, 12, Turkish GDP was rising much faster than most of Europe's. And so, you get this sense that Turkey had a ton of potential. What's happened since then? Well, it's interesting. If you look at a chart of Turkey's GDP growth, either going positive or negative, it has all these tremendous peaks and valleys, whereas the US would just kind of go along like this. So that suggests to me that there is maybe an even greater degree of monetary or fiscal manipulation at work in Turkey than in the US or in Western Europe, for example, because sometimes we forget you can use public works, you can borrow money as a government and then spend it on things like the new airport in Istanbul, and that adds to GDP. Magic. Yeah. But the problem is that Turkey is somewhere in between, a giant currency like the euro or the dollar, and a little tiny currency like the Icelandic kroner. You guys are at some midpoint. So if you have a giant currency like the US dollar or the euro, you can borrow and spend in your own currency. The American government can borrow in dollars and it can print dollars. The EU can borrow in euros and it can print euros. Turkey, if you look at its economy, especially since the crash of '08, its government, I should say, mostly borrowed in foreign currencies, in euro and dollar. So you can't just print euro and dollar. So that's a tough problem. So I get the sense that a lot of Turkey's growth over the last 10 years, or the good parts of its economy, were juiced by monetary policy. So unless and until you get out of that, out of this idea of currency manipulation, because we all know that messing with your currency doesn't produce any new goods or services, produces no new real wealth. It just sort of creates distortions and malinvestments in the economy, and oftentimes it benefits the early recipients of new money. And I don't know the particulars. I'm told that, for example, the new Istanbul airport was a very cronyist, project. So monetary policy tends to work and benefit certain connected elites, but it doesn't help average people at all. And so I wish Turkey, like just about any country, had the political will to stop messing with its currency, let the pain of a recession come, and then, like Iceland was able to do. Now, Iceland's only 300,000 people, but nonetheless, Iceland was able to get through a couple years of pain and then begin to rebuild on a truly floating currency that allowed the kroner to devalue. It made employing people cheap, and it made investment cheap. It made real estate cheap again. So the crash in Iceland was the cure. And it seems like in the US, in the Eurozone, and also in Turkey, the whole point is to avoid the crash. And that's ultimately not going to work.
Yeah, maybe with this connection, we can talk about economics a bit. We can notice that when Austrians try to explain economical issues, some people might say that, okay, these people are crazy, these people are so radical, and they are making conspiracy theories. So do you see the danger that in the future economics is going to be considered as conspiracy theory, because we can see the distinction, we can see the difference between Austrians and, let's say, mainstream economists, and they constantly say that Austrians, they are doing just philosophy, it's not economics, they just have to learn the economics. What do you think about this? What would you want to say?
Well, I guess how is that mainstream economics working out for everybody? If the point of a central bank is to avoid booms and busts, well, it seems like in the U.S. anyway, we have one every 15 years. So I'm not so sure that the so-called mainstream is working. And let's not forget that there were tremendous errors, made by the so-called demand side neo-Keynesians in the run-up to the 08 crash. I mean, they were wrong on just about everything. And now, the last couple of years since COVID, they have been deeply wrong about inflation, and I mean price inflation. So, you know, it's not like the so-called mainstream has this tremendous track record of success. So let's start there. Conspiracies at this point, half the time they're true. It just takes 20 or 30 years to find out that they're true. But I don't think there are conspiracies afoot so much as self-interest. In other words, there is in the West, I would argue there is a technocratic banking elite class which benefits from monetary and fiscal policy as they are currently practiced. So I don't think self-interest is a conspiracy. I think there's just a lot of really smart people who went to places like Cambridge and Oxford and Wharton and Harvard who really believe this stuff and think that they can, you know, manipulate money or manipulate interest rates and create prosperity when I would think the three of us would say, no, you have to have productive businesses which make a profit. That profit is reinvested. As a result, those businesses become more productive, hire more people. The price of goods and services drops for the average person, and that's how you build a productive economy. We've completely swallowed what I consider a serious falsehood in the West, which is that prosperity comes from consumption. Well, we know from Say's law, we know from basic economics that prosperity comes from productivity. It comes from profit, savings, capital accumulation, reinvestment, greater productivity. I mean, and there's no shortcut to that. There's no trick. There's no easy way to do that. It just takes hard work and effort. And it's, from my position, almost all economic and fiscal policy is an attempt to put off that hard work and that day of reckoning. So I don't consider that a conspiracy. I consider it a pretty damning critique. So I think we should not so much worry about what other people say or think, and in fact worry about the truth and worry about the well-being of average people in society.
Thank you. Now there's a question. While Klaus Schwab, the sweetheart chairman of the World Economic Forum, and his crew are now shamelessly and recklessly spelling out all of their plans and programs, can we, as people loyal to the non-aggression principle, justify initiating violence against the people who are carrying out this agenda and who have the slightest connection with it? This was a question from the youngsters.
Well, it's very, very tough to make sense of what's going on the, I guess, on the global level. And like I mentioned, there really are elites These people do exist, and they, whether they're in Turkey or the United States or where else, they tend to have all gone to the same Western schools, and they tend to congregate around international, global institutions. They tend to view themselves as globalists rather than nationalists of any particular country, regardless of whether they might be from. They tend to view the place of one's birth is just sort of an accident, and we all just travel around and go over wherever we want. And I think since COVID, but really even before that, since Trump and since Brexit, since these populist uprisings have been bubbling a little bit, Orban, we see the Catalans in Spain, so Europe has its own populist strains for sure. I think they've just become a lot more open about saying what they really think. And I think that's what the Great Reset is all about. Look, we are just openly saying that we want the world to have fewer people. We want the world to eat less meat. We want the world to stop burning oil and gas. We want the world to be shut down when there's a virus. I think these things have just become more open and said publicly now. So whether violence is justified or not, I think that depends on the facts on the ground. I mean, if your government, I think the Chinese people are now Chinese people. China is vast, so let's just see Chinese citizens who are being locked in their apartments in a city. I think they have the moral right to physically resist that. Absolutely, I do. That's different than sort of preemptively saying, well, we should round up these Davos World Economic Forum people and put them all in jail because of what they have planned for us. I mean, that's certainly a stretch, but it's a very scary time, and we thought, or we hoped, that the 21st century was going to be more decentralized politically and otherwise. So COVID, I think, represents an opportunity for the other side to say, look, we need global health measures, we need global government. And if we do have some big economic crash in the world, you can be sure that they're going to use that as an excuse to say, well, look, we need a global currency under the auspices of the IMF or the World Bank or whatever it might be. We can't keep having these national currencies go up and down against each other, and we can't keep having these national interests, currency wars in effect. We need to stabilize all this with a global currency. So yes, I think the globalists are very serious. I think they're open about it. They feel untouchable, that they can just say what they really mean and what they really plan for us. And let's hope that some of this really crazy physical restraint and authoritarianism we've seen in China doesn't spread. That's my hope.
Let's hope so.
Yeah. So maybe we can talk about economists a bit, let's say regime economists or regime libertarians. Do you think that they're simply ignorant, like they don't understand praxeology, or they don't understand how economics work? What is interest rate? What is time preference? What is money, sound money, fiat money? They just don't know. Simply, they have no idea about it, or they are self-interested. What do you think about it?
Well, I think it's both, in the sense that it's in their interest not to know about, the true role of interest rates, the true conception of value versus price, the idea of sound money, the idea of praxeology. I mean, why would they? I mean, we live in a little bit of a bubble because, for whatever reason, the three of us, presumably at a reasonably young age, were introduced to Austrian economics and started becoming lay readers of that. Now, if we had not been introduced to that and we had decided to become economists and go through a PhD program pretty much anywhere in the West, we would have gone through a thoroughly mathematized modeling, statistical, sort of neo-classical, neo-Keynesian education. And we would have come out of that either not knowing about the Austrian school or being dismissive of it. I mean, the idea that economics is a social science, I think, is somewhat lost in the economics profession. And I mean both academia and what you called regime economists, someone like a Paul Krugman. They just don't think of economics the way we do, as almost as a social science, which is almost a subset of philosophy or logic. They would view economics more as a business discipline, like accounting or finance, and they have what they call physics envy, which is when you want to apply the hypothesis and testing the empirical model of the physical sciences to the social sciences. So I'm not convinced that these are all bad people. I think that they literally think that economic precepts or principles can be expressed using mathematical equations, which, balance on each side, MV, I think they think that the 1800s might as well be the 1500s. They don't read stuff before the 20th century. But let's also remind ourselves that you can get a PhD in economics without taking any classes in the history of economic thought. So it's like you take some really smart kid who goes to, Harvard or something, and then drop him or her into an economics program, and they can actually graduate, and they don't know anything about all the economists who came before them and all the various schools of thought. And so it's just sort of like dropping them on an island without any context. So, the system is definitely designed to produce mathematical economists. And I would argue that they aren't doing any good, that they're doing a lot of harm, actually. And at the very least, they just have a bunch of comfy sinecures in academia and at places like the Fed. At worst, they're doing active harm by spreading untruths that make us all worse off. So, the profession's in big trouble. It's not doing any good from what I can see, and it's doing at least some harm. And that's a problem. The economics profession is something we don't talk about enough. We talk about economics, but we don't talk about the profession and its incentives and its distortion. So I don't think it's some big conspiracy. I think it's more just that the way you advance in economics by publishing or doing statistical or mathematical modeling, so you can go get a job at the central bank or something, I think it just discourages anyone from engaging in what they put down. They call it literary economics. You open human action, there's no graphs and charts, it's a bunch of words. So I think that's what's happening here, and we ought to be critics of the profession. I think that's part of our role, is to be strong critics. That's what it means to be heterodox, I think.
Thank you very much. And while we were talking about decentralization of the world, we agree that gold is sound money, and I have your silver coin from Mises Institute in my hand. But there are those who deny that Bitcoin is sound money because it's not a physical commodity. And this divides libertarians. What do you think? What's your position on the matter?
It does divide a lot of people. Could Bitcoin ever be a commodity? And must money have prior existence as a commodity to become money? Well, I mean, I'm pretty agnostic on this. I think you can have, Hayek said this, you can have degrees of moneyness. You can have good and better money. I mean, gold's generally been better money than silver. A Mercedes is generally better than a Yugo, but they're both cars. So I do agree that there can be degrees of moneyness, and again, this is all subjective. It depends on the individuals and the situation. You go into prison somewhere, and very quickly cigarettes or whatever become currency. So, whether something is money or is not money, I would say is up to the market to determine, not up to any of us as individuals to decree. In that sense, I would say Bitcoin is not yet money, in my opinion, because it's not even with the Lightning Network, I would argue it isn't in widespread use as money. And also, if you're a Bitcoin maxi, presumably Gresham's law applies, and you're clinging to your Bitcoin and using your fiat, right? Not the other way around. So there's that. But does it satisfy the regression theorem? That's a tough question. I've read a bunch of articles both ways on that. I would say that maybe it does, because the immutability, in other words, the embedded tech, the immutability of the blockchain and the visibility of that, and the elimination of a double spend, and the ability for the world to see the transaction, for the transparency. I think all of those together might form a bundle of tech, which we could say that's an underlying use, that has an underlying use apart from its moneyness. And I mean, honestly, whether it has a value apart from its monetary use, that it would appear that the answer is unequivocally yes, because lots and lots of people have bought Bitcoin all the way up to, I don't know, what was it, 64,000? And they're basically not, for the most part, not using it as money. So that, to me, suggests that the market is telling us it does have a pre-existing or underlying use. Maybe not as a commodity in the way you and I traditionally think of a commodity, but some sort of underlying use prior to its adoption as money. And that second part, its widespread adoption of money, that's, again, for the future and for the market to decide, not for me.
All right. Thank you.
Yes, some people object. They say that Bitcoin is violating the regression theorem because Bitcoin was not traded in a barter economy. Like there is no past of Bitcoin, like gold, for example. But some argue that it's not necessary because the most important thing is the price of yesterday, which is purchasing power of money from yesterday and then the day before yesterday and so on. And when we consider that, I see, it's my personal opinion, of course, I see Bitcoin, it can be used as money because right now we can calculate prices, we can see the purchasing power of money. It might be gold or it might be fiat money, it doesn't matter, US dollar. But then Bitcoin comes to the scene, and Bitcoin was had zero value at the beginning. Then it started growing. Right now, we can use Bitcoin as medium of exchange. It's not money yet, okay. But doesn't it mean that in the future, if we can use Bitcoin right now as medium of exchange, doesn't it mean that in the future it might be used as money?
Oh, it definitely means that. It might well be. Yeah, absolutely. And as opposed to the fiat alternatives available to us, we certainly hope we certainly root for it, right? I mean, the denationalization or the privatization of money has got to be maybe the single biggest libertarian project on earth. Far more than tax cuts or regulatory or something like that. I mean, taking money away from government and from central banks would be the ultimate technological advancement of the 21st century. No question, because everything, all goods and services require money. So money's half of that equation, unless something horrible happens and we're forced back into barter. We look at the quality of goods and services on one side. Maybe you want to look at a Honda Accord or something, but on the other side, what about the quality of the money being exchanged for it? So we know what governments do. We know what central banks do. They don't have anything new. They don't have any new tricks up their sleeves. They're just going to rinse and repeat because it's all they know how to do. They're not going to allow at least nominal crashes. They're going to reinflate when they must. They're not going to allow 15% interest rates, because Western governments couldn't service their debts at 15% interest rates on their sovereign debt. So we know what central banks are going to do, and we know that there has to be a monetary alternative. The only question here is if the market, even the black market, is allowed to operate, I think we will have a private replacement for fiat. The question in all this is whether they will literally use guns and prison and kidnap or kill people to stave off the destruction of their own currencies. Will they actually outlaw Bitcoin or something like Bitcoin? That, it's hard to say. There are a lot of psychopaths in government, and losing control over sovereign currencies would be absolutely disastrous for people who want political power. So yeah, I think we should expect them to fight it tooth and nail, but I do think that I do think that the long-term future there is pretty bright, that fiat currencies can't go on forever, and so the market will provide a viable alternative, because human beings are always going to want stuff, and they're always going to need to pay for stuff. So I would say I am long-term optimistic there.
Yes. What about price inflation and also monetary expansion? After 2008, after the crisis, Fed increased the money supply, but there was no significant price inflation. But after COVID-19, we see that there is really significant price inflation. What was the difference between these policies? What happened after 2008? Why didn't we see any significant price inflation? And what happened after COVID-19?
Well, the first question, I don't know, but I'll give you a theory. But let's start with COVID-19. COVID-19 is pretty simple, at least in I'll speak to the United States, because I'm most familiar with that situation. I mean, on the fiscal side, forget what the Fed was doing. Just on the fiscal side, the US Congress, between two separate giant bills, put about $6 trillion of fiscal stimulus into the economy. And I mean, that went straight into state governments, straight to companies, straight to individuals, straight to local governments. I mean, that was money that they just printed up at the Treasury level and put out there. So you had a bunch of people staying home and not working, not producing goods or services because of COVID, reducing the supply of goods and services, while at the same time you had about $6 trillion of brand new money injected right into bank accounts, not into bank reserves or buying treasuries or monetization of debt, but I mean just direct fiscal policy. So, look, there was a little bit of a lag, but now that's clear. And supply is still reduced. We still have global supply chain issues. So that the cause of the COVID price inflation, at least in the United States, is absolutely clear. It doesn't take a genius to understand that. If you go back to 2008, the question becomes, well, why wasn't there price inflation? As some Austrians predicted, let's be fair. And I mean, there's a couple suggested reasons why that I've thought about and read about. One is that, most of that monetary supply expansion in 2008-09, and then the successive rounds of QE, asset buying after that, just went into commercial bank reserves. In other words, the Fed was creating money and basically recapitalizing banks. It was buying their treasury debts from them. It was buying their mortgage-backed securities from them and crediting them with bank reserves. So all that debt got wiped off the books of banks, and they had lots and lots of cash reserves as a result. So by definition, you don't lend reserves. And during this period, banks were capital constrained. They weren't reserve constrained. I mean, they were getting interest on their reserves from the Fed, which was new. So that's one reason why banks didn't lend that money out as much as we might have thought they would. And a lot of that, a lot of the froth in the economy from 2008 forward went into the equity markets, which were hugely run up over the next few years, and into housing markets, but particularly housing markets in kind of the fancier parts of the two coasts of the U.S. So that suggests that all the Fed's money creation, reserve creation, and all the Fed's QE was mostly felt by wealthier people. People heavily invested in the stock market, people heavily invested in coastal real estate or fancier market real estate, and so that's where all the inflation occurred. In other words, there was asset price inflation rather than consumer price inflation. I think there are some reasonable mainstream critiques of that. I think that that's largely correct. That's my opinion. But I think what happened is that we had asset price inflation rather than consumer price inflation. I think that's the short story of 2008. But a critic would say, well, Jeff, that's kind of a self-serving Austrian explanation because you guys were projecting hyperinflation. So I do think we ought to acknowledge that criticism.
Thank you very much. And here's the last question. As you mentioned, you were here in Turkey a couple of times before, 4 times you mentioned, for the Property and Freedom Society events. What are your general thoughts about Turkey and the Turkish people? And do you have any recommendations for Mrs. Turkey followers?
Well, I haven't, I've spent some time in Istanbul, but my knowledge would be just simply that of a tourist, basically. And I haven't been to the entire eastern part of Turkey, which I'd very much like to see. I understand it's more rural, it's more religious, less affluent than the capital and then Istanbul. So it's pretty hard to generalize about 85 million people, especially in a country that's that geographically diverse. But I will say that I think Turkey has a lot of promise. For example, I think gold is more part of the Turkish psyche than it is in the West. You see, I think more people own gold. You see gold in the shops. I think gold is on people's minds in Turkey in a way that it isn't in the West. We're kind of dismissive of it here, like, oh, why would you own that? That doesn't even pay a dividend, and just again, its location, but also, you've got from my understanding, far less of a welfare state than Western Europe and the U.S. So that creates a work ethic, and there's no reason that Turks ought not to be bullish about the future. I mean, I don't know enough about Erdogan, to speak confidently, because we get a very, we get sort of a one-sided perception of Erdogan in the American press. That the story here is that Turkey was secularizing and it was going to join the EU and it was going to be, it was going to become sort of this European crossroads. And until Erdogan started going off the rails and, wanting to crack down on civil liberties and crack down on journalists. And, all of a sudden he wants, that he's some sort of radical. But, I don't know that I buy that. The Western media the Western media wants to use Turkey as a wedge for U.S. interest against other Islamic countries, because Turkey is viewed as much more moderate. I think Turkey is almost like 98 or 99% Muslim, but nobody in America says, complains about Muslim nationalism in Turkey or Saudi Arabia, right? In America, somehow, if you say, well, 70% of Americans are Christians, like, what are you, a Christian nationalist? It's like, well, no, I just pointing out a fact, So, I think that that Turkey ought to be rich. I don't know if that means you got to have a change in government or not, but I would say that if you're Mises Institute Turkey, you've got Hoppe there, so I would certainly love to put together. I'll bring some people over, and some financial support and all that, and we'd love to have a big event, let's say in Istanbul or something in or around PFS.
Sounds
right
great.
Before or right after.
Sounds wonderful.
I think one of the main differences between United States and Turkey is that in United States there are different opinions, like Democrats, let's say, Republicans, and Libertarians. You can see that some people defend free market actually in United States, but in Turkey it's not the issue. Interestingly, almost or maybe all of the political parties, they are just interventionists. They just want to shape the economy. They just want to shape the people and mind of the people. That's why none of the political parties say, okay, we are gonna make the market free, so we are gonna try to do something about it. But they are all saying that, okay, when we come to the power, then we will change this situation. We will improve this situation. So it's a kind of intervention. In Turkey, I think this is one of the main challenges. It's not like United States. There are no different opinions like in the United States.
But since all political parties are lefties over here, they are becoming more free marketeers, I should say. Even CHP mentioned that they are for free market, and their liberalism is flourishing over here because of the pressure of the government and inflation and so. So I'm not that pessimistic.
Well, you certainly have the region around Bodrum certainly has unbelievable potential, because if you look at the European Mediterranean, France and Spain and Italy, they're all just absolutely consumed with bad ideas and making things expensive, making things difficult. So Turkey could be a real haven, I think. It could be a Switzerland or a Monaco, given its warmer weather and its beaches, and I think there'd be a huge appetite for relocation or at least second homes in Turkey. I'm just not sure if you want that. If you want a bunch of Westerners invading.
Now we have a couple of million Ukrainians and Russians since last year, so we are welcoming anyone at the moment.
Fair enough.
So we would like to thank you very much for your time and for your effort. It was a pleasure to have you over here. And
absolutely.
Looking forward.
Hopefully I'll see you this coming September.
Hopefully.
Okay. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much.
All right.